Good morning. Welcome to the Global Renewables Hub. My name is Ute Collier. I'm the Acting Director of the Knowledge Policy and Finance Center at IRENA. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here on a Saturday morning, which seems to be quite a challenging time, but it's great. So what we're doing today is to discuss the difficult topic of finance. Title is, as you can see, Bridging the Renewable Energy Investment Gap, and we'll tell you a bit about how big that gap is. And then we have a fantastic panel who can give us their insights. So what we will start with is a presentation which is based on work we've done this year, the report which some of you will hopefully have seen already, which is the Global Landscape of Renewable Energy Finance. And some of that was also published in our World Energy Transitions Outlook. So we'll have a presentation from my colleague Diala, but also our partners in the report, which is the Climate Policy Initiative. So that'll be the scene setter, and then we will have a panel discussion. So the panel we will introduce afterwards. So I'll pass to Diala straight away, and I hope you find it insightful.
Thank you, Ute. So I'll go straight to it. So as Ute mentioned, our flagship report, IRENA's flagship report, is the World Energy Transitions Outlook, where we look at the scenario or the energy mix by 2050, where we need to be to stay within an increase of temperature that is within 1.5 degrees. So we call this at IRENA the 1.5 degree scenario. To achieve this scenario or this energy mix, we will need a lot of investments. So what you see on the left side is the planned energy scenario. So if the current plans and policies that are currently put in place are achieved, these are the investments that will be needed, around $103 trillion cumulatively between now and 2050. But if we wanted to implement an energy mix or an energy transition that keeps us within 1.5 degree increase, we need $150 trillion cumulatively until 2050. So as you can see here, those investments are not only in energy transition-related solutions, we still have some investments in fossil fuels, but mainly it's around 90% of those investments are in solutions that will help us transition. Those obviously include renewable energy electricity, renewables directly used for heating and cooling and transport, electrification pathways, so we need to electrify end uses, energy efficiency, hydrogen, and other technologies. So if we only focus on the energy transition related technologies, this amounts to an average investment almost per year of just a bit less than $5 trillion. And every year that we do not reach this investment means that the years after we will have to invest more. Now, if we look at it short term, and as you know, as you may know, we launched a report on tripling, the need to triple, and this is our motto on the booth, tripling renewable capacity by 2030 and doubling energy efficiency. And those are the investments that will be needed. So on average, we're going to need $1.5 trillion, and this is only in renewable capacity by 2030. And just a bit less than $700 billion in energy efficiency and conservation. And the same thing applies here. Any year that we do not meet this target means that the year after, this is going to be an even larger number. So looking at the trends of what we have done in the past years, 2022 was, at that time, a record-breaking year. We expect 2023 to be higher. But at the time, a record-breaking year of $1.3 trillion invested in the energy transition. This was about 70% more than before COVID, so that was pretty impressive that year. we saw that renewable energy and energy efficiency still attract the largest investments, but what was remarkable is this increase in electric transport or in infrastructure for electrified transport and EVs, which is a positive sign that we are on the right track to electrify at least transport. Now that was the good news. Of course, a bit the challenge is that this 1.3 we said needs to more than triple or even almost quadruple so that we can meet our annual investments needed for 1.5. Now, if we look at the investments in renewable energy versus investments in fossil fuels, we still see that fossil fuels receive around double the investments of renewables on an annual basis. And today we're going to even hear more about our panelist Chris from IISD about the public investments that go into fossil fuels and how large those still are. So and these investment decisions that we are making today are going to impact the energy mix of tomorrow, of course. Now, zooming in on renewable energy, 2022 was a record-breaking year. We see that investments continue to increase despite the challenges that we saw during COVID and the supply chain issues that we faced. But then, as we mentioned, this almost needs to triple in order to be on track to achieving the energy transition needed. Another remarkable observation here is that although the investments are growing, they are all increasingly concentrated in a few technologies. So solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, those are the most mature technologies. Of course, there are other reasons. They are more readily available, they are modular. But in a sense, because they are reliable and mature technologies, we see them attracting most of the investments, while other technologies that are important for decarbonizing end uses, we still need to see more of that happen. Now, another trend that we see that is also alarming is that although those global investments are increasing, as you can see in this graph, they are increasingly concentrated in a few countries and regions. So countries and regions that were the same as the technology, where investors are comfortable investing, private capital goes where the risks are low, are increasingly attracting the bulk of investments. So when we make our calculations, we see that more than half of the 85% of these investments are only serving half of the world's population, and the other half are only receiving 15% of these investments. And that other half is the half that is in desperate need for renewable energy, for socioeconomic development, for access, and for other sustainable development goals. So here the challenge is not only to increase investments globally, but the challenge is to spread them a bit more equitably among countries and to take them where the private sector doesn't want to go. And this is where we want to focus our discussion today. Now, looking at the least developed countries, as we mentioned, those are the most in need of renewables. They attracted less than 1% of investments on average between 2013 and 2020. And this is not looking like a just energy transition. So every year we look at the NDCs, and at this COP we're going to be launching a brief on NDCs. And for the LDCs, for the least developed countries, we looked at their LDCs, and we see that the LDCs are aiming for more than 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. But as you can see, around half of what still needs to be achieved is conditional on support. So this is why we always show the need for international collaboration and support, the flow of funds, some of them, or mainly most of them, public funds from the global north to the global south, to catalyze and kickstart this energy transition. And we look at the disparities in per capita investments that are received. So if we look at those numbers between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe and North America, we see that the disparity in per capita investment has doubled between 2015 and 2021. So in 2015, Europe and North America, which is mainly the US, were receiving 22 times more investments per capita than sub-Saharan Africa. In 2021, This went up 40 times more and 57 times more in North America. So again, this message of all the investments being concentrated in or benefiting let's say, the highest income populations, this needs to change for us to have a just transition. And on the right side, you see the capacities installed totally by more than 3 terawatts globally, but also you see them per capita, and you see that as a result of concentrated investments, of course, the capacities are concentrated, meaning all the benefits that come with renewables, including jobs and value creation, are all benefiting the same countries. So this is why we say that we need more public intervention, policies and investments to channel more investments to those countries that have so far been perceived as high risk for the private sector. And this perception of risk, it doesn't only deter the investments from coming. When they do come, they come at a very high cost of capital, which means that the poorest or the lowest income populations are paying the most for energy, which often comes to them as very basic. So this needs to change for this energy transition to be able to catalyze economic growth and equality in the world. So what we propose is a framework whereby the public investments can flow through different intermediaries, most of them coming from the global north to the global south. And we look at the different policies and the different instruments that can channel those public investments towards technologies, but also beyond deployment, also to the whole ecosystem that can help us achieve a lot of benefits. So localize value chains, build capacities to build not only energy security and autonomy, but also create an economy that is around this energy transition. So without further ado, I would like to call Baisa to talk more about some of those aspects of public investments and climate finance. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and great to be here. Thank you for Irina for the great collaboration over the years. It's been fantastic to work with you guys. So my name is Baisa. I work for an organization called Climate Policy Initiative. It's an analysis and advisory organization with deep expertise in finance and policy. So we work with businesses, governments, and financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. So I would like to bring discussion today a bit towards sort of in the context of global climate finance, as well as sort of the emerging developments in the international climate finance architecture and the growing momentum from it. So global annual climate finance in 2021 and 2022, so it's 2-year average, exceeded 1 trillion. And it's been a great news for the whole climate finance communities because it's the first time since Paris Agreement in 2015. And it was mainly driven by renewable energy, as well as electric vehicles, transport sector, and across all different sectors. But when we put things into context, as Diala was mentioning, the investment gap is huge, and if we depict it and put it in a picture, it looks very difficult, right? And we need to increase finance by at least 5 times in 7 years, and that's an immense challenge we have. However, I'd like to change the narrative that the investment is not a cost. It's actually investment for our future. It's an opportunity. And why? It's because if we don't invest now, the costs in the future is going to be even more. So first time in my life, I tried to say this number, which was difficult. It's 2,328 trillion US dollars in costs. And I cannot imagine what it is. How do you compare it, right? But all of it is basically all the losses and damages we incur because of climate change, sort of things related to rising sea levels, events related to extreme weather events, labor losses, reduced agricultural yields, so all of that, if we put that into economic context. And what's even more difficult to comprehend is that it doesn't include other things that it's difficult to sort of put it into economic context, so things like migration, conflict, and things like that. So we can't possibly put it in economic terms. Biodiversity losses as well. So this is why investment needs is not a cost, it's an opportunity, it's for us, it's an investment for our future. So going back to the renewable energy sector overall in climate finance, particularly in mitigation finance, they play a key role. They take about 44% of investment in the last 2 years. And we should really be sort of, how to say, like, I don't want to say grateful, but it's still a good progress, because we've seen massive investments in solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, because we're thinking of in the context of the last 2 years, which were really challenging, high interest rate, high supply chain costs. You know, we were going out of COVID, and all other sectors were really, it was challenging to get finance, but nevertheless, renewable energy sector was making progress, so we should really hold on to that. Now, the other thing to sort of mention is that more recently, discussions around international finance institutions reform have been gaining particular traction earlier this year and throughout this COP. And on top of that, domestic capital mobilization. So it's really much aligned with what Diala was mentioning in her last slide around the role of public finance. So therefore, there's really an opportunity for us to, collectively think about the international financial institutions and their approach to climate. And that could lead to dramatic increase of volume of finance, so that international financial systems deploys the finance that meets climate finance needs. So we released a report earlier this year to sort of think more operationally how that systems level reforms for public finance could look like. So it is in 3 levels. The first one is increased focus on the scale of country sector platforms. And so it's moving away from this project by project level approach, right? Like when World Bank deploys one project in another country. So you have to have a larger sort of country sector platforms where you work with the national governments in a specific country and find facilities to a systems shift. So this sort of implies financing on the needs-based funding. So it uses effectively both international and domestic resources to improve the quality of finance. And the second one is deployment at scale of risk-sharing instruments. So instead of thinking like risk-sharing just on this one project and debt-only financing from the MDBs, they can catalyze at much larger scale, including through expanded and new guarantee products. So you can really think at the systems level to address these chronic risks related to, for example, exchange rate risks, currency, and to increase the local currency finance, and also to increase project preparation facilities. And then the third area is business model overhaul of the MDBs. So that repositions them as mobilizers in chief, including the standardization of multiple processes, balance sheet optimization through a new originate-to-distribute model, and then eligibility for more concessional finance, and also cross-country data sharing. So MDBs are working across multiple countries, and there's so much opportunity to share a lot of knowledge that's going on around. And then one final thing I wanted to mention before we go to our panels is there are lots of different ways to channel finance through innovative financial solutions, and that implies a lot of collaboration between public finance but also private finance. So here on this slide you can see sort of 6 group of financial and non-financial instruments and tools that we can sort of use to overcome investment barriers. So from the top, it's really the most traditional approach where you finance through debt, equity, sometimes with a bit of grant. But down the line, we have a whole range of different options that is available for us. So just to highlight one example, results-based finance instruments. So what they can do is that they can address counterparty risks. So the finance is tied to the achievement of project outcomes and milestones. So it's so that the outcome is guaranteed, and that's how you get the finance. The other thing is lack of short of long-term finance barriers also addressed through results-based finance. So linking again project outcomes to milestones reduces the risks and makes finance more available. And maybe just one more thing is around the risk mitigation instruments. And they're so important in the context of international finance reform. So particularly all these risks related to currency risk, counterparty risk, government barriers. So there needs to be a much larger scale discussion around how the risk mitigation instruments can be sort of redesigned, rethought, and launched at scale. So I'm very much looking forward to our panel discussion and explore what are the options available and what's the role of public finance to further expand and increase in renewable energy investments. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Baisa. Can I please invite my panel to come on here? Right. So let's see how we do with the microphones. You've got one at the end. Then we share. Yes. All right. Could you please first introduce yourselves?
So, my name is Daniel. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute.
Hi, good morning. My name is Amelia Santos Paulino. I am the Chief of Investment Research at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development.
Testing, yes? Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Beaton. I'm a director for public financial flows with IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Tonwe, and I lead policy and regional strategy for GOGLA, which is the Global Industry Association for the Off-Grid Solar Industry.
Great, thank you. So what we'll do is we'll do one round of questions and answers, and then I'll also invite the audience to think about any questions which we can also address, and then potentially another second round. All right, let me start with Amelia. So you saw that Diala presented our findings from the latest brief on NDCs and renewable energy targets. Obviously, one of the issues is that we have lots of parties which have committed to NDCs, but for many developing countries, you need to have commitment to international financial support as a prerequisite to achieving these targets, especially, of course, in the less developed countries. So I know UNCTAD has conducted a similar analysis on NDCs, which also provides a detailed analysis on the investment needs. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Thank you so much, and I'm grateful to Irina for bringing this question and this discussion. Let me just take 30 seconds to tell you about the World Investment Report. For those that don't know, the report is the flagship publication of UNCTAD, of the UN, that presents annually trends on all global foreign direct investment flows, but also since 2019, we have been mandated to analyze investment in sustainable development goals, and I'm come back to that if we have a second round. So every year we present trends, and also policies, trends in policies, which speak to what the previous presenter discussed, but also we have a theme chapter. So this year the theme chapter was investment in the energy transition and investment in sustainable energy for all. So we did two analyses. One, what drives the high cost of capital? And in order to get there, we went into, as the moderator said, a very extensive analysis of national determined contribution, which is the main instrument since Paris agreements that where the parties committed to the net zero and to reduce emissions and so on and so forth. So we look at the NDCs published and the updated ones, and we found that 151 of the parties have, out of 193 countries, have an NDC. But when you go into the detail, and one thing that we did, I mean, we look at the median and at the average of the transition target, how the countries want to see their energy mix by 2035 or 2050. But then looking down, what was very telling, it was that the number of countries with detail of the investment needs and how they are planning to mobilize that investment was very, very narrow. Only 40 countries out of the 153 that had communicated an NDC had a clear path or a clear assessment of what are the investment needs for them to reach their targets, whether there is the 1.5, whether it's the 50-50 renewables, non-renewables in the mix. So only 40 countries have indicated what is the sources, and 48 countries, developing countries, indicated the needs. So this is very important because that leaves a very big void when we come to this type of analysis, like how can we help countries to realize the pledges that we see here. I will not go into the technicalities, but we have identified what are the average needs and put it into the context of the SDG needs that we estimated in the report. I'm happy to come back to some of these, but I mean, takeaway, 48 countries only out of all the NDCs presenters have identified investment needs, and 40 countries have identified sources. And the most cited sources for these funds are multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. We make the points made earlier even more important on how we can work out these partnerships better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's very interesting in a way. I mean, sometimes when you look at these NDCs, they seem to be very high-level ambitions, but if you dig down, it's hard to find the detail. And also for other things like the renewables targets.
And something else before we move on is that there is also a lack of consistency between the targets and the pathways in the energy transition plans and NDCs. Some countries have sort of articulated a joint transition plan based on the NDCs, but many countries don't, which made the discussion more complicated.
Which is, of course, what our report
Your
is
report is about,
well.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's very valuable.
Okay, let me move on then to Patrick, focusing, of course, on developing countries. So the decentralized renewable space has the potential to provide access to millions of people fairly quickly. I mean, just as a reminder to all of you, I think we're on 675 million lack of electricity access, but also 2.3 billion lack of access to clean cooking. It's a significant problem which we mustn't forget about. And of course, providing access through renewables, especially decentralized renewables, can transform lives, create multiple socioeconomic benefits. Can you speak a little bit about the scale and type of financing needed for this sector, and how much of this is expected to or needs to come from foreign sources as opposed to in-country?
Thank you for the question, Ute. And I think your question speaks to why we are actually at COP. The danger with the conversation we're having at COP, and even the numbers that we've seen today, right, is it's very easy to celebrate all these successes, 1.5 trillion per year coming into renewables. But if you ask that question, about less than 1% is going into sub-Saharan Africa or the markets that need it. There is a huge problem there. I remember if you go back to the French Revolution, where the king was asking, why are these people protesting? And everybody, they were told they don't have bread. His answer was, let them eat cake, right? I think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about we'll celebrate carbon reduction, we'll celebrate all these things which are super important. Let me emphasize that. To reach 1.5, to save what's happening with the climate, to think about our next generation, we need renewable energy. It needs to scale. We need to reduce emissions everywhere. But today, the people at the front line who are, one, the least able to pay, the most poor, who live in the hardest to reach places, do not have a pathway to access energy and that they need. So why are we here? It's because, as I think you've just heard, this inconsistency between the targets and the pathways, right? So we've got a target for SDG 7, universal energy access for all. But when we look at the plans to say, okay, I am living in Mozambique, in a place where there's been displaced by insecurity. I'm living in DRC, where you cannot even get there by road. How am I going to be able to access energy? I don't have an income. I don't have all these things. And this is where we really need these pathways. So why do we need the public investment? We know there's a move to really activate the private sector to come and invest in this space. But what you're telling the private sector is, we are not able to serve them, we cannot reach them, they have no ability to pay, they are very poor, there are all these things, and yet somehow you're supposed to be able to do it in a way that is profitable. There's a gap there, and this is where public investment is really going to be needed. We have to accept it. We need to have public investment that opens up those markets and gives it the ability for private sector to go. We need public investment to say we will reduce our taxation so that the costs are lower. We need public investment looking at this to open up local finance. We need public investment to even help us find the technologies at a price point that is ready to enable productive use. All these reasons need public investment. And finally, we also need public investment to de-risk this space. You're telling private sector to go in and invest in, the numbers say, the most, high-risk markets. I think we've seen, for example, across, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, currency devaluation in Kenya, which was one of the most stable, 30% this year, Nigeria, currency devaluation. All these reasons are why we need public investment, not that the technology is not there. The problem is not the technology. The problem is not the interest from the local companies. The problem is not the interest from the customer. The customer needs a product. It's putting that together, and this is where we really need public investment. The numbers you asked was about at least 15 to 20 billion per year into our off-grid renewable energy space. What we are seeing is far below that. In 2022, the highest we've ever had was about 600 million, and of that 600 million, about 10 companies took the lion's share, but for everybody else, it was maybe 20-30% of that money. So we really need support. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And it just sort of makes me think, like in Europe, governments have pumped billions to support their energy, energy consumers because of the affordability crisis after the war in Ukraine, pushing up energy prices. And sure, I mean, of course, there are affordability issues, but it just makes me think at the same time, we expect, as you said, the poorest people to pay for electricity or energy more broadly without any subsidies. It's just crazy, isn't it? This just needs to be recognized more. Okay, let's move on to Daniel. Daniel, you've also worked extensively in Africa to understand the main risks facing investors in renewable energy projects. Can you briefly introduce your projects in Africa and then go over some of the most important risks and for both domestic and foreign investors?
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ute, and thanks, Diala, for inviting me. So I'm going to start by saying a few words about the research program that we're starting and the reason why we chose renewables as the first sector to look at. So at SEI, the Stockholm Environment Institute, I lead a new research program called Finance for Sustainable Development. And with this program, what we try is to flip a little bit the question of finance and development. You have a lot of research and a lot of discussion nowadays about how the for-profit financial sector is going to radically change to incorporate sustainability considerations, as they call it, into their, let's say, operations. But we want to look more at the way that sustainable economic activities in developing countries can become attractive investment opportunities with the help of policies, of government policies, of multilateral policies, and to enable the financial sector to do what they normally do, what they do best, that is to find sources of value and to just through their way of doing business as usual to contribute to the things that we want, which is, of course, the achievement of SDGs. And our first project with this approach was looking at risk mitigation and transfer for utility scale renewables in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to say a few reasons why we chose this sector as our first project, and I think they are relevant for our discussion here. First of all, if we look at climate finance, well, of course, estimates differ, but roughly 2/3 of what's needed for mitigation is going to be renewables and grids. So we're already, by looking at this, we're covering a huge deal of climate finance needs. Second, I believe this is the sector where it is realistic to think that private business and private investment will play a significant role. You have a clear revenue model. There are tried and tested business models. People want the product, as you were saying. So you can realistically expect for private investment to mean something here, which is less the case in other SDG relevant sectors like health or education, where I don't even know if you want them. And third, we chose sub-Saharan Africa because there's really not enough progress. Let's say as an example, when we were starting our project, we thought we would need a sampling technique to pick some of the projects so that we analyze them. But then we realized there are so few. We could just look at all of them. If you exclude South Africa, you can actually analyze all projects, utility scale projects in sub-Saharan Africa. And with this approach in mind, we took projects, successful projects. We found the people who actually worked on getting them on the ground, developers, lenders, regulators, off-takers. And we asked them, how did you do it? How did you allocate risk? What were the barriers? What can we learn from your project? To what extent is this scalable? Can we expect that your project is going to be replicated in the same country or in others? And of course, there was some variation in the answers, but there are some stories emerging. I'm going to say just a few of them. First of all, counterparty risk, payment risk is tremendous. You are entering into a contract with an entity that has hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. I mean, this is from the very beginning, a difficult start. Then currency risk. You were saying about the devaluations in Kenya and Ghana and other countries that are otherwise economically relatively developed. Currency risk is tremendous. You have your revenues in local currency, but you have to service your debt in hard currency. And most of the time, you push that risk to the only entity that's supposed to bear it, which is the utility and then the government. Then, without MDB, DFI involvement, none of the projects would be possible. So this was confirmed by some of the developers we talked to. It would not be even imagined. Without the concessional lending, without risk mitigation, without the project preparation that they put in, these projects would not be possible. And on the positive side, in most of the countries we looked at, Mozambique, Malawi, etc., getting the first project takes an approach of all it takes. We're gonna do everything possible. We're gonna invent new tools. We're gonna invent new products to get the first project on the ground. But once that is reality and it is on the ground, there is a demonstration effect. The second project will use the term sheets, the regulatory changes that you've done. So it does pay off, even though it's extremely difficult to get that first project. We see the example of Mozambique is very, very illustrative for that. After a really difficult start, now the sector in Mozambique is developing. You see even competitive tendering being prepared under the ProLayer program. So yes, the risks faced by the people actually getting a project financed are tremendous, but they can be allocated, and the role of the public sector and MDBs is absolutely crucial.
Interesting. So how many projects was it in total you analyzed?
So we divided our work into regions. So we started with Southern Africa, excluding South Africa, just to make sure, because that's a different scale. And I think we had 17 projects in Southern Africa, of which we chose 4 to deep dive on. And the ones we know best are the ones in Zambia.
Sounds very interesting research. All right, let me come to Chris. So Chris, we very often hear the rhetoric that public investments are very limited. I mean, generally, but of course, especially for the less developed countries. And they should not or cannot be used to directly support renewables, but instead should be used to mitigate financial and other risks, as very well explained by previous speakers. So IISD has been tracking public investments in fossil fuels. Can you tell us some of the main findings of your latest report and how that might link to renewables?
With pleasure. So we don't have a problem of a lack of money. So there's a lot of money being spent on energy right now by governments in lots of different ways. You can see a graph highlighting some of the key findings from our latest report on this topic up on the screen. Apologies, it's a little hard to see. This is a summary piece from a publication we called Burning Billions, which was trying to bring together the best available data on government support for energy from all sorts of different places. So we've looked at work by the IEA, by the IMF, OECD on fossil fuel subsidies. We've looked at work by Oil Change International on international public finance. And we've also brought together some of our own data on state-owned enterprises. We don't have data yet for 2023 because we're all in 2023, so who knows? It's going to be interesting to see what the numbers are. But we do have data for 2022, and our estimate is globally, government spent at least 1.7 trillion supporting fossil energy, just fossil energy. This is an underestimate. So we don't know actually what the true volume of support is. I won't go into all of the high nerd details as to why, but I can tell you all of the different pieces that add up to this big number involve incomplete data sets because things are not fully transparent, they're opaque, they're hard to estimate. There are lots of instances where we know there's support, we just can't quantify it. So this 1.7 trillion number is a very conservative estimate about what the full number is. 2022 was a special year, because it was the year of the war in Ukraine. We had an energy price crisis globally, so we had lots of intervention from government. So you can see that on the graph, we have a real spike up in 2022. But even so, if you look at previous years, the average that we're seeing is about 800 billion per year. So if we put these numbers into context, I think Diala, we heard in your presentation, actually very neatly, that the number required annually in investments in clean energy was 1.7 trillion per year. Oh, wow, it's exactly the same number. Look at that. So 1.7 trillion is out there. And the number you gave was the number of total investment that's required. This is actually just public money. So that means that even if we just wanted to ignore private markets entirely, we could, if there was the political will, just meet all of our clean energy needs with public money. Now that wouldn't be the most efficient way to do it, but it really puts into context what these numbers show. Same is true with the average of about 800 billion per year. ISD's done analysis where we've crunched through IPCC scenarios, and our estimate was that to install the levels of solar and wind capacity that are required to be on track for 1.5 C by 2030, we need about 800 billion per year. So wow, look at that. The average we've been looking at is about 800 billion per year in the previous years. So we don't have a lack of money, we have a lack of political will.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting kind of figure, isn't it? But of course, I guess governments would also argue in 2022 that money spent had to be raised through increasing public debt.
Yeah.
And that's not something they could continue doing. I mean, some of you may have heard in Germany there's a bit of a crisis just now on the government trying to use, well, I think it's carried over COVID debt for energy transition measures. So how would you answer that point?
I think it's a great point. I think it's very easy to look at these numbers, to get very frustrated and to enter a very simplistic state of mind where we say, let's just kind of put it all into clean energy, and obviously it's not that easy. In the last year, a lot of the support measures that we saw for fossil fuels were because consumers around the world were really struggling, right? So governments are intervening to try to help them. I think that kind of comes back, though, to these points that we don't need to reinvest all of this support. Actually, we just need a share of the support. And the share of the support that we would need to leverage the volumes of investment that we need in clean energy isn't out of this world to provide. So a lot of the times, these support measures are trying to help low-income groups. But there's a better tool. And if you use that better tool, you need to spend less money to do it. So you're going to have savings left over, right? A lot of these kind of funds that you're looking at are investments by state-owned enterprises. So this is just publicly owned companies where governments can direct these companies, listen, help us deliver our clean energy targets, or just help to deliver our conventional energy sector. So there you've got pretty black and white choices, I'd say, about to what extent are firm level goals in state-owned enterprises really being aligned with delivering clean energy futures. And then I think in the context of public finance, a good share of this is international public finance. So I think, again, the reallocation of that is not actually going to change any rules, create any new huge debt problems for anyone. And we see this with the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. So obviously we have, the CETP. It was launched in Glasgow as the Glasgow Statement, and we've got now an increasingly large number of governments who have committed that they're going to completely end all international finance for fossil fuels within 1 year, and they're going to repurpose that towards clean energy. So that would be my answer. Look at the people who are already doing it. It actually doesn't look that tough. So is it more complicated than the numbers sometimes suggest? Yes, but there's a more than adequate space to find ways to support clean energy when you look at these financial flows.
Okay, that sounds positive. Now, let me see whether there are any questions from the audience. Diala. Wait, shall we screen?
So we see that most of those investments are subsidies for consumers, but usually the consumers who consume the most are the highest income populations, right? So how much of this, and what is the solution to direct those subsidies to the people who actually need them?
Yeah, Chris, but also if anyone else wants to come in on that, that's fine.
I'll maybe kick us off. So it's a great question. I think that in many cases, when governments are providing energy subsidies for consumers, what they're really trying to do, their objective is to try to just compensate consumers to help them deal with a high cost of living. And so it would be much, much more efficient to just provide people with cash. Because you can use cash for anything. And if you're a household who doesn't need to spend money on energy, but you're still affected by inflation that's been caused by the energy price crisis, you can use this cash to help you buy food. You know, you can use this cash to invest in education or whatever may matter to you. So you've got many more choices about how to improve your welfare. Like, it's a paternalistic approach to social protection to just assume governments know what people need and that's cheap energy. I think, though, that there are complexities. So, for example, in the context of clean cooking, which I think you touched on earlier, Ute, we know that just giving people cash but making the price of clean cooking technologies really expensive actually doesn't work. So there's lots of complexities. Like, this is an area where actually what you need are very targeted support policies. So if you want to ensure people have got access to non-fossil cooking, like induction, solar cooking, there you really need to be building solid social protection systems where you've got registries of the households who are most vulnerable and who struggle most to meet their cooking needs. So you can then try to target the support towards those. So it does vary depending on the energy service in question, but by and large, often better social protection is the first answer.
Amelia, you wanted to make a point?
Yes, I want to make a point. I mean, it's the other side of the story is that how complex the energy policy making in developing countries is. And still, I mean, we look at, let's say, over 190 countries for the last 20 years, and still tax incentives. I mean, the regime is mostly tilted towards provided tax incentives towards the investors. And tax breaks, that holidays, it's basically tax-based, and so there is not necessarily a trickle-down effect to the point that you made about the social protection. So, for example, we saw that in 2/3 of countries, they are still relying on tax incentives as the main policy tools. And in many cases, very complex, and as I said before, it's not formulated in the energy transition plan. So they come out with ad hoc measures and laws, but mostly based on tax and VAT incentives and breaks. So how this speaks to the social element is an important issue that has to be brought at the table. And the other issue is the debt component. I mean, we just published the Trade and Development Report, and like 80% of the energy transition is funded by non-concessional sources. And 20%, let's say 60% non-concessional, 30% debt, around 30% or more equity. So it's a very high cost for developing countries, especially a highly indebted one. So this discussion of the financial architecture should be also brought to the table.
Yes, and I mean, of course, like at IRENA, we publish this report on costs of renewables, and there's some very low costs depending where it is. Of course, we can achieve it. I mean, partially it's based on the resource, but a lot of
and
it
the
is
risk.
also
The risk.
Yeah, the risk.
Yeah, what
and
Patrick
the
was
cost of
mentioning.
capital.
The risk, yes.
So in most of Africa, this would not be achievable, especially not sub-Saharan Africa. Patrick, did you have a point?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think what she's pointed out, that these programs are subsidizing the rich and at the cost of the poor, there's a lot of validity to it. For example, if you look at generally the public investment into the utility scale infrastructure, and if I'll pick a country like Mozambique, right? Energy access picture across the rural areas is 3%. So 97% of people in Mozambique in rural areas don't have access to energy. And this is subsidized, and everybody bears the cost of the public finance. So therefore, you'll find the society is subsidizing 3% to access a benefit that the rest don't. I would say what we really need is a holistic approach, but also into the details to look at who are we trying to reach and then target them, that there's a channel, there's a pathway to make sure that everybody is getting into the reach of public support and public finance.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? No? One over there.
My name is Brendan Cahill. I work for a company called Morpheus. We're a developer of tidal and river energy systems with a focus on off-grid communities. The question I have for the panel is, we think our technology is a very strong value proposition in combination with other renewables, but acknowledge that there's a technology risk or uncertainty around it. For a developer like us, how do we overcome the challenge of combining that risk with the existing risks
wants to
maybe I
take
can
that.
I can try. I think so. We are one vertical, right? But we work across the industry. We work with like the Clean Cooking Alliance, who's really focused on the larger 2.7 billion without access to renewable. I mean, clean cooking, and also the Africa mini grid developers and the others. And what we've seen is a lot of the technologies based on the technology and its capacity are finding a niche and a place. We've seen quite a lot of micro hydro. I'm not quite familiar in terms of your technology on rivers and all that. But what we are seeing is with the varying needs, the varying kind of service levels that are needed, and where you find communities across living on rivers or wherever they are, that there'll be a place. And I think the great thing with our space is also there's a lot of interest from multilateral partners, development partners, to see pilots, to see technology, proof of concept, and all that. I think you would probably, even here, find somebody that is interested to explore. And if it's validated, then from there, I think that you'd need to see the business model validated, where it's the best communities it can serve, and the pathways to be able to do it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, then I have another round of questions. So actually, let me go back to Daniel. So, I mean, you've pointed out all the struggle these projects face. So in your view, what are the main actions or risk mitigation instruments needed to see an increase, a significant increase in global investments going into Africa? And of course, especially, you know, let's exclude maybe the South Africa or Morocco's of this world.
Yes, so my belief and actually the findings from this project that we've been doing is that finance does flow into viable projects. We see DFIs and private financiers fight each other and despise each other for stealing their very few projects they have. So I tend to agree there is no real shortage of capital per se, but there is a shortage of viable projects, and action on solving some of the main sources of unviability, or I don't know how to call them, would be urgent. I'm just gonna mention a few. First of all, particularly after COVID, most countries in the region are suffering from enormous amounts of public debt. Some countries are close to or even in sovereign default, and it's really hard to believe or to expect that investors are going to flock into a country that can't afford to pay its existing creditors, right? So this is just a non-starter or a very bad start to any sort of investment proposition. So work on the common framework for debt treatment is probably the most important action that needs to be done, and I would say there is something going on. We shouldn't despair. There is action being tried and implemented. Second, and related, the utilities across sub-Saharan Africa are in a terrible state. Like they're also massively indebted. They tend to charge less than their costs, which is never going to be a successful business, right? Long term, which makes them not the ideal counterparties you would want to work with. So if you're going into a 20-year PPA with an entity that's struggling, again, not a good start to your project. And also this prevents them from investing in transmission, which is another bottleneck that we need to mention and address. Third, at least from my experience, credible demand growth like demand for electricity in countries that you know, where people can't afford to pay the bills, and industries aren't really growing, it's not a given that you actually need a lot of extra electricity. You need it from a moral point of view, because there are people who don't have it. But is that an investment case if they can't pay? Going back to public investment, this looks more like a case of public investment, which is what Europe has done, right? Way before anyone had access to ability to pay for anything. So
Can I just check? I mean,
Yeah.
about the utility point, though. I mean, for them to put up prices might not be viable politically to start with, because they're state-owned generally. So what is the solution there?
Well, I mean, you do get the impression that they tend to be. They lack, let's say the independence that you would want from a utility. They typically are state-owned, and the state tends to, you know, use them either for unpopular policies like raising prices, or for extracting value if there is any value, and which is, again, universal. This happens everywhere. But when decades of these types of practices accumulate, you definitely need let's say, a significant program to improve these utilities. And I would say there's programs like Get Transform that are doing a great job, and you see improvements even in the most embattled ones, like ESCOM or ZESCO, etc., across Africa. So probably patience, probably some debt restructuring that includes them, and you will see any IMF agreement with many of the countries will feature the electric utility as one of the main sources of debt. So a combination of better management and let's say improved business models, improved regulation could hopefully happen, and not have to rely on getting, you know, tariffs up, which you probably have to do anyway.
Okay, thanks. Let's go back to Amelia. You've, at UNCTAD, you've proposed the Global Action Compact for Investment in Sustainable Energy for All. Can you tell us a bit about what that's trying to achieve?
Thank you so much. I mean, as I mentioned before, we tried to look at the different elements. Perhaps I oversimplified what I did. What drives the high cost of capital in developing countries? And for example, I mean, we saw that in developing countries is more than twice the cost of debt in developing countries compared to developed economies. And we look into all the details. So looking at the challenges, we try to come up with a sort of coherent policy package that speaks to the three elements of the energy transition, that is meeting the climate goals. We found even low-income countries committing to a timeline of 2035 to meet the climate goals, which is unrealistic given the needs, providing affordable energy, and ensuring energy for all, SDG 7. So basically what we try to do, okay, what are the means? Basically, we have to improve national policy making and also international investment policies. I mean, many of the international investment agreements are all generation. And here there are two things, is that providing a space to the investors, foreign investors, but also a space for the state to regulate. And this is something that we have worked a lot with the Institute for Sustainable Development. So we need to go back to the drawing board of these international investment treaties and bilateral investment treaties to make it more viable, not another cost for the investors and for the investment in the energy transition. And then global partnerships and regional partnerships. When we did the analysis, this is another component of the policy package, because when we did the analysis, we saw that partnerships don't matter. For example, if you just bring international investors to any of these projects, whether a greenfield or international project finance, it will reduce the cost of capital, I mean the spread of debt on debt, by 8%. But if in this partnership we have a multilateral bank, it reduces the cost by 10%. And if we talk about modern public-private partnerships, it can reduce the cost of debt up to 40%. So this is why we are in this compact, in addition to national and international policies, we are trying to rethink the partnerships. Then the other issue is the financing mechanisms and tools, as it was presented earlier. There is a broad spectrum, and especially because we talk about investment flowing, there is a lot of money. Like in the report, we show 70% of global FDI goes to developing countries, but out of this, only 1/10 goes into renewable energy, and hence the gap that Diala explained, that is around 1.7, we calculate around 2 trillion annually. So the financial mechanism and instrument is part of the compact, and then capital markets and sustainable finance. I mean, there is a huge boom, even despite the recent crisis on the sustainable and capital markets, but still 80% of these funds are domiciled in developed countries. They don't go to developing countries. So the framework tried to put a compact that works in those 6 areas. But the other issue is national policy coherence. As I said before, it's not only an issue of energy transition or energy policy making, but also industrial policy. I know that Irina and others through the REMAP have tried to improve the policy coherence in a beautiful number of countries, but when you look into the details, there is a complete incoherence between trade, industrial, and investment policy. So there is another area. For example, my own country, the Dominican Republic, the recent energy transition plan is a sort of national development plan for the transition that brings all the goals of the different sectors. So this is one way of operationalizing and speak to what it was mentioned earlier. The big problem that we have been analyzing also in the report is the lack of bankable projects in developing countries. And it all relates to the cost of capital, lack of institutional constraints, and especially if you look at the needs like grids and all the technology needed for the transition. I mean, the upfront cost for investors is very high. So this compact is just policy coherence, and what we call is for a more prominent role of investors, investment policymakers in this discussion. I mean, usually many countries don't have an investment ministry. Usually this is hosted by the trade ministry, and again, this is why policy coherence is important. We work a lot with investment promotion agencies, IPAs, which basically they are policy takers. They facilitate the investment package to investors, but they don't make the policies. They take the policies. So including them in the discussion is part of the package. So 6 points: national, international policy making, regional and global cooperation, reform of MDVs, and more prominent role to financial and non-financial instruments.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, I mean, we've heard a lot about the fossil fuel subsidies, so still not quite clear what's stopping some countries from reallocating some of that. Have you got any good examples of where something has actually happened?
It's a good question. Why haven't we seen more action on this issue? I think we've seen commitments on this since 2009. That was when the G20 first committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term. And it's been a long medium term since then. We've got commitments in the SDGs to reform fossil fuel subsidies. We've seen cover text declarations where all UNFCCC parties have agreed that fossil fuel subsidies need to go. And action still isn't really happening at a systemic level, I would say. I think that there are good examples of individual countries taking action on some subsidy policies. So for example, India and Indonesia have made huge progress with reforming their gasoline subsidies, their diesel subsidies, and their kerosene subsidies. However, what seems to be happening, and the cycle we've been in for some time, has been a kind of death by 1,000 cuts approach of choosing one subsidy policy and spending 3 or 4 years trying to reform it, whilst there's this huge, set of subsidies which are very complicated, often at a national level, that are not really getting addressed. So I think it seems very clear that one of the things that we need in this space is more ambition or more political will. And we need that political will to be looking at systemic national solutions. So we have a systemic global set of commitments, right, which looks at all of these support measures together. But what we're seeing translated into national policy is just little bits and pieces. So there are some interesting things happening. So Canada this summer introduced the first national framework policy on fossil fuel subsidies. And so this is a national policy framework that applies to all subsidy policies together at the same time for the first time. It's very good in that it includes a WTO definition of subsidies, which is very comprehensive, though there's also possibly still work to be done, because it also has a nice list of exclusions, which mean that some subsidies might not be included, and those lists are really quite broad right now. But I think that's one good first step. I think NDCs are another. So the NDC situation is actually really very grim on this topic. So we've mapped NDCs, and there are 16 countries who've got fossil fuel subsidy reform in some way in their NDCs, and in some way. Often it's in a very light way. It's like one fuel product, that's it. So the stock take, I think, is an opportunity to highlight just how much we've got a disconnect between what's been in political rhetoric and what's actually appearing in national plans. The third thing I'd say to keep an eye on is happening later today. So there will be a press conference in press conference room 1, zone B8 at 3 p.m. where the Netherlands is going to be launching a joint ministerial statement on fossil fuel subsidies. So I would say look towards that. I think that's an interesting development, which hopefully will see a little bit more commitment to shifting these public financial flows from fossil to clean energy.
Okay, let's see what happens at 3. Let's hope it's good.
It's a mystery.
And finally, Patrick, we're almost out of time, but can you just give us a couple of examples of successful financing models for off-grid, where you feel it's kind of also scalable?
Successful financial models. I think I would start off with what the private sector has done, right? Especially first in innovating and exploring things like pay-as-you-go, which is a financing facility for consumers, which has proven its ability to open up new markets and provide access to finance for several customers. We're exploring what's being called, pay for the service, essentially, where, for example, if it's healthcare electrification or some consumers where they only pay for the energy that they use, that work is still yet to be figured that out. We're seeing a lot of work partnering between the industry and microfinance institutions, who also have quite a bit of experience working with their customers to essentially offer more products and services and to their consumers. We've also seen quite a bit of work through programs like the React SSA from CEDA or REAP, which is really investing into local institutions, trying to improve their readiness for investment, improve their business models, and help them get to the stage where, as they're saying, are there investor-ready companies or deals? And I think the issue is, it's not that they're not there, but there's some little work that needs to be done to help them package right, get them to the right level, make sure that the systems are ready for when the investor comes in. But I want to go back to the question you asked him, which is around what more really should be done by to open up investment, right? And I would say a couple of things, please, if you don't mind. One is, we know the constraints, but we don't see enough work to actually solve that. What do I mean? We see that currency is a problem, but there's no currency hedging or insurance that is coming out. We know the problem of paying in hard currency is a problem, but we don't see enough local currency financing at an affordable level that is coming up into the market. We see issues around the debt level, particularly in our industry. But we are not seeing enough equity investment or tools that is convertible debt or all that. And I think these are really where we need to look at, are the solutions that are being offered more of the same? If the World Bank, if somebody else provides another debt facility into a market that does not need another debt facility. So we have the money, as I think a lot of people are saying, the money is there, but we cannot unlock it because of these gaps. And I think these are the gaps that we really need to meaningfully address so that we solve that problem.
Okay, that's a very good note to finish off on. So the positive side is we have the money. Negative side is we're not making enough progress on unlocking those gaps. So thank you very much for the panel, for these very interesting insights, and Diala and Baisa for the presentation. And thank you for the audience for listening and participating. Thank you.